Yet all it is the key to a little room at the foot of the west tower, behind the still room, at the end of a dark little corridor full of horrid cobwebs that would get into your hair and frighten you if you ventured there. Oh, and you'd find it such a dull little room. But you must promise me, if you love me, to leave it well alone. It is only a private study, a hideaway, a den, as the English say, where I can go sometimes on those infrequent yet inevitable occasions when the yoke of marriage seems to weigh too heavily on my shoulders to see myself wifeless. There was a little thin starlight in the courtyard as, wrapped in my furs, I saw him to his car. His last words were that he had telephoned the mainland and taken a piano tuner onto the staff. This man would arrive to take up his duties the next day. He pressed me to his Vichunia breast once and then drove away. I had drowsed away that afternoon, and now I could not sleep. I lay tossing and turning in his ancestral bed until another daybreak discolored the dozen mirrors that were iridescent with the reflections of the sea. The perfume of the lilies weighed on my senses, when I thought that henceforth I would always share these sheets with a man whose skin, as did theirs, contained that toad-like, clammy hint of moisture. I felt a vague desolation that within me, now my female wound had healed, there had awoken a certain queasy craving of tainted food for the renewal of his caresses. Had he not hinted speech and looks of the thousand baroque intersections of flesh upon flesh? I lay in our wide bed accompanied by a sleepless companion, my dark newborn curiosity. I lay in bed alone, and I longed for him, and he disgusted me. Were there jewels enough in all his safes to recompense me for this predicament? Did all that castle hold enough riches to recompense me for the company of the libertine with whom I must share it? And what precisely was the nature of my desirous dread for this mysterious being who, to show his mastery over me, had abandoned me on my wedding night? Then I sat straight up in bed, under the sardonic sheets of the gargoyles carved above me, riven by a wild surmise. Might he have left me, not for Wall Street, but for an importunate mistress tucked away God knows where, who knew how to pleasure him far better than a girl whose fingers had been exercised hitherto only? And slowly soothed, I sank back on to the heaping pillows. I acknowledged that the jealous scare a tincture of relief. At last I drifted into slumber, as daylight filled the room and chased bad dreams away. But the last thing I remembered before I slept was the tall jar of lilies beside the bed, how the thick glass distorted their fat stems so they looked like arms, dismembered arms, drifting drowned in greenish water. Coffee and croissant to console this bridal solitary waking. Delicious. Honey, too, in a section of comb on a glass saucer. The maid squeezed the aromatic juice from an orange into a chilled goblet, while I watched her as I lay in the lazy midday bed of the rich. Yet nothing this morning gave me more than a fleeting pleasure, except to hear that the piano tuner had been at work already. When the maid told me that, I sprang out of bed and pulled on my old student, in which I felt far more at ease with myself than in any of my new fine clothes. After my 3 hours of practice, I called the piano tuner. I called him in to thank him. He was blind, of course, but young, with a gentle mouth and grey eyes that fixed upon me although they could not see me. He was a blacksmith's son from the village across the causeway, a chorister in the church, whom the good priest had taught a trade so that he could make a living. All most satisfactory. Yes, he thought he would be happy here. And if, he added shyly, he might sometimes be allowed to hear me play, for, you see, he loved music. Yes, of course, I said. Hear me play? Certainly. He seemed to know that I had smiled. After I dismissed him, even though I'd woken so late, it was still barely time for my 5 o'clock. The housekeeper, who, thoughtfully forewarned by my husband, had restrained herself from interrupting my music, now made me a solemn visitation with a lengthy menu for a late luncheon. Along her nose. I understood at once that one of my principal functions as chatelaine was to provide work for the staff. But all the same I asserted myself and said I would wait until dinner time, although I looked forward nervously to the solitary meal. Then I found I had to tell her what I would like to have prepared for me. My imagination, still that of a schoolgirl, ran riot. A fowl and cream! Or should I anticipate Christmas with a varnished turkey? No, I have decided. Avocado and shrimp, lots of it, followed by no entree at all. But surprise me for dessert, with every ice cream in the icebox. She noted all down, but sniffed. I'd shocked her. Such tastes! Child that I was, I giggled when she left me. But now, what shall I do now? I could have spent a happy hour unpacking the trunks that contained my trousseau, but the maid had done that already. The dresses the tailor-maids hung in the wardrobe in my dressing-room, the hats on wooden heads to keep their shape, the shoes on wooden feet, as if all these inanimate objects were. I did not like to linger in my overcrowded dressing-room, nor in my lugubriously lily-scented bedroom. How shall I pass the time? I shall take a bath in my own bathroom, and found the taps were little dolphins made of gold, with chips of turquoise for eyes. And there was a tank of goldfish, who swarm in and out of moving throngs of weeds, as bored, I thought, as I was. How I wished he had not left me. How I wished it were possible to chat with, say, a maid or the piano tuner, but I knew already my new rank forbade overtures of friendship to the staff. I had been hoping to defer the call as long as I could, so that I should have something to look forward to in the dead waste of time I foresaw before me. After my dinner was done with, but at a quarter before 7, when darkness already surrounded the castle, I could contain myself no longer. I telephoned my mother, and astonished myself by bursting into tears when I heard her voice. No, nothing was the matter. Mother, I have gold bath taps. I suppose that's nothing to. Yet there still remained 1 whole hour to dinner, and the whole unimaginable dessert for the rest of the evening. The bunch of keys lay, where he had left them, on the rug before the library fire, which had warmed their metal so that they no longer felt cold to the touch, but warm almost as my own skin. How careless I was! A maid, tending the logs, eyed me reproachfully, as I'd set a trap for her as I picked up the clinking bundle of keys, the keys to the interior doors of this lovely prison of which I was both the inmate and the mistress, and had scarcely seen. When I remembered that, I felt the exhilaration of the explorer. Lights, more lights. At the touch of a switch, The dreaming library was brilliantly illuminated. I ran crazily about the castle, switching on every light I could find. I ordered the servants to light up all their quarters too. 1,000 candles, one for every year of its life, and everybody on shore would wonder at it. When everything was lit as brightly as the café in the Gare du Nord, the significance of the possessions implied by that bunch of keys no longer intimidated me, for I was determined now to search through them all for evidence of my husband's true nature. His office first, evidently. A mahogany desk half a mile wide, with an impeccable blotter and a bank of telephones. I allowed myself the luxury of opening the safe that contained the jewellery, and delved sufficiently among the leather boxes to find out how my marriage had given me access to a jinn's treasury, parures, bracelets, rings. While I was thus surrounded by diamonds, a maid knocked on the door and entered before I spoke. A subtle discourtesy. I would speak to my husband about it. She eyed my serge skirt superciliously. Did Madame plan to dress for dinner? She made a moue of disdain when I laughed to hear that. She was one of my Poirier's extravaganzas, with the jewelled turban and aigrette on my head, roped with pearl to the navel, to sit down all alone in the baronial dining hall at the head of that massive board at which King Mark was reputed to have fed his knights. I grew calmer under the cold eye of her disapproval. I adopted the crisp inflections of an officer's daughter. No, I would not dress for dinner. Furthermore, I was not hungry enough for dinner itself. She must tell the housekeeper to cancel the dormitory feast I'd ordered. Could they leave me sandwiches and a flask of coffee in my music room? And would they all dismiss for the night? Mais oui, madame. I knew by her bereft intonation I had let them down again, but I did not care. I was armed against them by the brilliance of this hoard, but I would not find his heart amongst the glittering stones. As soon as she had gone, I began a systematic search of the drawers of his desk.